Ibrahim Traore shifted his weight lightly from one foot to another, his posture relaxed, his presence understated. No bodyguards were flanking him, no flashing cameras, no whispered recognitions or double takes from the passing travelers. Dressed simply in a gray hoodie, jeans, and worn leather shoes, he looked no different from the countless others waiting for their flights. Perhaps a bit quieter, perhaps a bit more patient. No one guessed that the man standing there alone was none other than the President of Burkina Faso. This was how Ibrahim preferred it: anonymous, grounded, connected to the people he served. He had no taste for grand gestures or self-importance. Power to him was not something to be displayed like a medal pinned to the chest. It was something worn quietly, like a well-loved coat, something earned through service and humility. Today, returning home from a crucial diplomatic meeting in Europe, he maintained that same silent dignity. Discussions had been intense. Debates about Africa's future, sovereignty over natural resources, and the delicate balancing act of independence in a world still riddled with hidden pressures. But those battles were behind him now. For a few short hours, he allowed himself to simply be a man on a journey home. As boarding for the Air France flight to Ouagadougou began, Ibrahim approached the gate, offering a warm "Bonjour, ça va?" to a nearby airport worker. The worker smiled back, seeing just another traveler among many. And that, too, was how Ibrahim preferred it. When he entered the aircraft, he moved with quiet efficiency, nodding politely at the flight attendants who barely noticed him. His boarding pass directed him to seat 280 in business class, by the window, where he could sit unnoticed and watch the clouds roll past in peace. He settled in, pulling out his phone and scrolling through notes from the meeting, his mind already half at home. If anyone had looked closely, perhaps they would have noticed the slight air of command in the way he moved, the ease of a man accustomed to decisions, to carrying the burdens of others. But no one looked closely. No one cared, or so he thought. A few rows behind him, a storm was quietly beginning to gather. Among the passengers was a senior French businessman, the CEO of a major European energy company, a man whose life had been defined by privilege and power. He was no stranger to Africa, but to him, Africa was a place to extract from, not a place to respect. And today, his expectations of privilege would clash violently with a truth he could never have anticipated. When the CEO arrived at the gate, flanked by assistants carrying leather briefcases and wearing nervous expressions, he was told the unthinkable. Business class was full. Full? Impossible. He was accustomed to immediate upgrades, private lounges, and red carpets rolled out at a whim. The CEO's face darkened, his polished shoes tapping impatiently on the floor. "I'm a strategic partner in key African development projects," he reminded the gate staff loudly enough for nearby travelers to hear. To him, that statement alone should have dissolved all obstacles. The airline agents, flustered, whispered among themselves, refreshing screens, double-checking manifests. But the answer remained unchanged. The seats were taken. Still, the CEO would not accept it. Without hesitation, the staff escalated the situation, calling a senior flight attendant on board to fix the seating problem. Her name was Claire. She walked briskly down the jet bridge, her Air France uniform crisp, her posture rigid with authority. A tight, professional smile was plastered across her face, but there was no warmth behind it, only calculation. Stepping into the business class cabin, Claire let her eyes sweep over the passengers. Her gaze moved quickly past the men in suits, the women with designer handbags, the neatly coiffed businessmen tapping on laptops. Then her eyes landed on Ibrahim, a dark-skinned man in a simple hoodie, sitting alone in 2A. No Rolex flashing on his wrist, no expensive briefcase tucked under his seat, no entourage, no loud phone calls, no outward signs of importance. To Claire, it was obvious. He didn't belong. Without a second thought, she leaned toward another attendant and whispered, "Probably a mistake. We'll move him." And with that single arrogant assumption, the first crack formed in what would become a public shattering of prejudice. Claire approached Ibrahim with the mechanical smile she reserved for minor annoyances. "Monsieur," she said politely but firmly, "may I see your boarding pass?" Ibrahim looked up, offering the pass without hesitation. Claire scanned it. Seat 2A, correct. Yet something inside her bristled. She forced another smile. Sir, we may need to relocate you to economy class to accommodate another passenger. We will, of course, offer compensation. The insult was delivered softly, wrapped in politeness, but it was unmistakable. Ibrahim Traore blinked once, slowly, absorbing her words. Then he asked calmly, almost curiously, "And why me?" Claire stiffened, caught momentarily off guard. "No reason, sir. Just a small operational adjustment," she answered, avoiding his gaze. "A guest more important than me?" Ibrahim continued, voice steady, betraying neither anger nor offense. Claire smiled again, thin, rehearsed, empty. She didn't answer. Around them, a few passengers began to glance over their newspapers and screens, sensing that something was not quite right. Yet no one spoke. No one intervened. Ibrahim sat back in his seat, folded his hands, and said simply, "No, I will remain here." The line was drawn, not with shouting, not with anger, but with quiet, immovable dignity. And though Claire did not know it yet, the moment she chose to dismiss that quiet resistance, she was not merely confronting a passenger. She was about to confront an entire nation's pride, a leader's strength, and a lesson that would echo far beyond the walls of that plane. The first spark had been struck. The storm was only beginning. Claire stood motionless for a moment, struggling to process the simple word that rarely defied her authority: no. Passengers rarely refused her, especially not passengers like him. In her world of silent hierarchies where looks and appearances often dictated unspoken privileges, this quiet defiance stung far more than she cared to admit. Still smiling, now thinly veiled with irritation, Claire straightened her posture. "Sir, I must insist. This is for operational reasons," she said, her voice dipping into a colder tone. Authority slipped into her words like a dagger hidden in silk. Ibrahim Traoré, still seated calmly in 2A, met her gaze with unwavering steadiness. His hands rested lightly on his lap, the embodiment of a man who understood power not as something shouted, but as something carried within. "If it's operational," he said evenly, "then why am I the one being asked? Why not anyone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Claire hesitated. She hadn't anticipated a challenge. Certainly not a logical, composed one. Around them, business-class passengers pretended to mind their own business, but their curiosity betrayed them. A newspaper was lowered here. A laptop screen dimmed there. Whispers began to ripple across the cabin like invisible currents. Yet still, no one spoke aloud. The CEO, still at the gate, grew impatient, fuming that his special status hadn't yet been accommodated. Time was ticking, and he would not wait like an ordinary man. Meanwhile, Claire pivoted quickly. She murmured something to the captain, vanishing briefly into the cockpit. When she returned, her plan had shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Rather than confront Ibrahim directly again, she moved her attention to another passenger, a young black man seated a few rows behind. "You, sir," she said, flashing that same professional smile. "We may need you to move to economy. Please come with me." The young man blinked, confused. "Why me?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Claire gave no answer, merely reaching out for his boarding pass with an expectant hand. It was a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. From seat 2A, Ibrahim Traoré slowly rose to his feet. The cabin seemed to still around him, as if the very air was waiting to see what he would do. He did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He did not point fingers or make a scene. He simply spoke, a voice low, deliberate, undeniable. "Enough!" Claire froze mid-motion. Her mouth opened, but no words came. "You are making decisions," Ibrahim continued, each word cutting cleanly through the tension, "based not on tickets, not on seating policies, but on skin." Passengers who had remained silent moments before now exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others beginning to realize the magnitude of what was happening before their eyes. Claire, cheeks flushing beneath her polished facade, scrambled for control. "Sir, I must ask you to sit down. Please do not cause a scene," she said, her tone teetering between command and desperation. Ibrahim Traoré met her gaze again, and this time, something shifted. In that calm stare was not defiance for its own sake, but something far deeper, an unyielding reminder that dignity cannot be negotiated. For the first time, Claire hesitated, truly hesitated. She saw something she could not name, and yet could not ignore, flickering behind his dark eyes. A warning, a weight, a history. She retreated without another word, her steps clipped and angry. The CEO, finally allowed to board with an entourage of apologies, swept into the cabin like royalty returning from exile. Claire met him with exaggerated smiles, fawning over him, ensuring every minor need was met with eagerness. A glass of champagne, an extra pillow, warm towels, and all the while, 2 rows away, Ibrahim Traoré sat back in his seat, silent, observing, waiting. There was no anger on his face, no need for it, because he understood something Claire did not. Some storms begin not with thunder, but with a quiet refusal to be moved. And once they build, no force on earth can stop them. Outside the cabin windows, the horizon was beginning to glow with the first hints of sunrise, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Inside, a different kind of dawn was coming, and soon everyone on board, Claire, the CEO, the passengers lost in their devices, would be forced to look up and see it. The engines roared to life beneath them, a low, thunderous vibration that filled the cabin with a gentle hum. Passengers tightened their seatbelts, the familiar choreography of travel taking over. The aircraft shuddered slightly, then began its slow, deliberate roll away from the terminal. Outside, the runway stretched endlessly into the misty morning light. Inside, a different kind of tension coiled invisibly among the passengers, threading its way up and down the aisles. Claire made her final pass through the business class cabin, clipboard in hand, pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't. Her eyes darted to Ibrahim Traoré now and then. Glances, never lingering. Something about him unsettled her, but she pushed the feeling down, hard. To acknowledge it would mean admitting she had miscalculated, that she had possibly done something far worse than simply reassigning a seat. She wasn't ready to face that. Instead, Claire clung to the comfortable illusion that she was in control. She smiled brighter at the CEO, who lounged back in his business class seat like a monarch, sipping champagne, barking short commands at the attendants. His arrogance filled the space like a heavy, sour perfume. From his window seat, Ibrahim Traoré remained the picture of calm. He made no demands. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched, not with anger, but with a profound, measured patience that was somehow more powerful than any outburst. The plane accelerated down the runway, gathering speed, until finally it lifted, cutting cleanly into the open sky. Beneath them, French soil fell away, replaced by endless clouds. As the seatbelt signs dinged off, the dance of service resumed. Carts clattered down the aisles, trays of drinks and meals appearing like clockwork. But the mood in the cabin remained strange. Some passengers noticed how Claire lingered longer at certain seats, laughed more easily, and bent closer when speaking to those she deemed important. Others, those she judged unworthy of business class, received clipped service or were ignored altogether. And though no one dared voice it, the pattern was painfully clear. Ibrahim Traoré saw it all. He watched as Claire doted on the CEO, laughing at his jokes, leaning in too close, nodding eagerly at his boasts. "We're bringing order to Burkina Faso," the CEO said loudly, as if performing for an invisible audience. "They're lucky to have us. Without structure, there's only chaos." Claire laughed, tossing her head back lightly, her agreement unspoken but understood. 2 rows away, Ibrahim turned his face toward the window, hiding the small, rueful smile that touched his lips. Order? Chaos? He knew better than anyone the true meaning of those words. The cost of order imposed by foreign hands. The hidden price of development is that it often leaves its people poorer, not richer. The CEO had no idea he was boasting about saving a country to the very man elected to lead it. A few seats back, a middle-aged African woman, a nurse by the looks of her, caught it all. She shook her head in silent disbelief, whispering to her seatmate, "That's our president, they're mocking." Her neighbor gasped quietly, but said nothing more. Like the others, they respected Ibrahim's wish for anonymity. They would not expose him. Not yet. Hours passed. Outside, the endless sea of clouds shifted, glowing orange as the sun climbed higher. Inside, the cabin dimmed for rest. Overhead lights softened to a muted glow. Most passengers slept. Claire moved like a shadow through the aisles, careful to avoid Ibrahim's row, unless absolutely necessary. When she did approach, it was with mechanical coldness. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked, voice strained with false courtesy. Ibrahim glanced up briefly, expression unreadable. "Water is fine," he said, then turned his gaze back to the window. Claire nodded tightly and walked away without another word. The CEO, in contrast, was spoiled with offerings: wine, gourmet meals, and attentive laughter at every half-witted remark. He reveled in it, basking in the manufactured adoration. He didn't even glance once at Ibrahim. But Ibrahim didn't need acknowledgement. He didn't need validation. He was waiting for the moment when truth, undeniable and irreversible, would break across this carefully constructed illusion like a wave crashing over fragile sandcastles. And it was coming. Faster than anyone aboard could imagine. The soft chime of the overhead speakers signaled the beginning of descent. The flight was nearing its end, but for some, the true journey was only beginning. The captain's voice, calm and professional, floated over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Ouagadougou. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed." A ripple of motion swept through the cabin. Passengers stirred from sleep, stretched stiff muscles, and gathered scattered belongings. The low murmur of conversation resumed, punctuated by the occasional click of seatbelts snapping shut. At first, everything felt routine, familiar, safe. But outside the windows, something unusual caught the eyes of a few passengers. From their vantage point, they could see the tarmac below, not the typical quiet bustle of luggage carts and maintenance crews, but a military presence. Rows upon rows of black SUVs gleamed under the fierce Burkinabe sun. Armed soldiers stood at attention beside the runway, uniforms crisp, weapons slung precisely across their chests. Behind them, high-ranking officials, ministers, dignitaries, lined up in solemn formation, the air around them heavy with anticipation. Inside the cabin, confusion rippled first, then unease. A foreign businessman whispered to his seatmate, "Are we landing in a war zone?" Another replied nervously, Maybe someone important is arriving." The French CEO, adjusting his tailored jacket with an arrogant smirk, leaned toward Claire and muttered, "Must be for me." He chuckled at his joke. Claire laughed too, her earlier tension easing. Surely this grand welcome had to be for someone of his stature. Who else could warrant such a ceremony? She straightened her uniform, smoothing invisible wrinkles, already rehearsing how she would graciously lead him off the plane first, ahead of the others. A perfect gesture of deference. The aircraft touched down with a soft jolt, tires gripping the runway. A ripple of applause broke out from a few passengers, a tradition on some African flights. But it quickly faded into a strained silence as the realization began to spread. The convoy outside wasn't here for just any VIP. It was for someone far greater. Someone is already on this plane. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the CEO stood prematurely, adjusting his cuffs, preparing to bask in the recognition he believed was his due. But before the doors could even open, a tall figure boarded the aircraft. A military officer clad in black, his beret sharp against the harsh sun outside. The plane fell utterly silent. Only the heavy, deliberate sound of the officer's boots against the aisle carpet broke the stillness. He marched with unhurried precision, eyes scanning the cabin, ignoring the wide-eyed stares of passengers. And then he stopped, at seat 2A. Ibrahim Traoré sat calmly, still belted in, hands resting loosely in his lap. The officer snapped into a rigid salute, his voice cutting clean through the tense air. "Mr. President, welcome home." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, as if the very oxygen had been sucked out of the space. Claire's clipboard slipped from her hands, clattering noisily to the floor. Her face drained of color. The CEO's mouth fell open, a silent protest dying in his throat. Every eye turned toward Ibrahim, the man they had dismissed, belittled, overlooked, now revealed not as an ordinary traveler, but as the leader of an entire nation. With calm grace, Ibrahim Traoré rose to his feet. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence, once invisible, now pressed down on the cabin like a rising tide. The CEO stumbled forward, desperate to recover. "Mr. President, I had no idea," he stammered, words tumbling over themselves. Ibrahim simply offered him a nod, polite, detached, as one might offer to a stranger at a train station. No anger, no satisfaction, only an unwavering dignity that needed no explanation. Behind the officer, another figure stepped aboard, this one from the Ministry of Justice. His expression was hard, uncompromising. He pointed directly at Claire and the CEO. "You two," he said sharply, "will accompany us immediately." Claire blinked, stunned. "Wait, what? Why?" "You are being detained for public disrespect toward the head of state," the officer said coolly. "An offense taken very seriously on Burkina Faso soil." Claire stuttered incoherently, glancing around for support that wasn't there. The CEO blustered, protesting his importance, his connections, his influence. But it was useless. No special privilege would shield them now. They were escorted off the plane in handcuffs, their heads bowed low, arrogance shattered beyond repair. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, the lesson searing itself into their memories. Power does not always announce itself. Dignity does not always wear a crown. And sometimes the people you dismiss most easily are the ones who carry entire nations on their shoulders. Ibrahim Traore stepped off the plane last, into the fierce sunlight of his homeland, where a sea of cheers and waving flags greeted him. A leader among his people, a storm that had moved with silence until it broke the sky wide open. The scorching sun beat down on the tarmac of Ouagadougou International Airport, making the asphalt shimmer like molten glass. Claire and the CEO were led away in separate directions, flanked by stern-faced soldiers, their crisp uniforms a silent testament to the seriousness of the moment. There were no angry shouts, no dramatic protests, only a stunned, almost reverent silence from the passengers who watched them go. Inside the airport terminal, the air-conditioned halls buzzed, not with the usual hum of travel, but with the electricity of something far greater. Whispers raced through the crowd like wildfire. "Did you see? It was the president. They had no idea who they insulted." By the time Claire was escorted into a sterile, windowless room deep inside the airport's security wing, the news had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the terminal. Footage taken by a few alert passengers, shaky, grainy clips of the salute, the handcuffs, the shocked faces, had already found their way onto social media. Within minutes, hashtags exploded. "In Respect Africa," "Short Justice for Traoré," to "No More Humiliation." Across the African continent, phones vibrated, notifications pinged, and screens lit up with a singular, shared fury. A collective awakening to the quiet, everyday insults that had, for so long, been swallowed in silence. In the interrogation room, Claire sat stiffly at a metal table, her hands trembling. The officer across from her, calm, unreadable, flipped through a thin folder before looking up. "State your name," he said, voice clipped and formal. "Claire Dupont," she croaked, her French accent heavier under the strain. "And your occupation?" "Senior flight attendant for Air France," she whispered. The officer nodded, jotting a note. Then he closed the file and folded his hands. "You are being formally charged," he said coolly, "with public insult and discrimination against the head of state of Burkina Faso, abuse of authority, and misconduct on national soil." Claire's mouth fell open. I didn't know who he was," she burst out, desperation cracking her voice. The officer didn't flinch. "You didn't need to know. You only needed to treat him like a human being." The words hit harder than any shouted accusation. Across the hall, the CEO fared no better. Blustering about diplomatic immunity, business connections, and economic influence, he was quickly silenced with a simple, devastating fact. In Burkina Faso, no man stands above the law. "You insulted the soul of a nation," the investigator said, fixing him with a cold stare. "You will answer for it." For once, the CEO had no clever words, no slick negotiations, no power to wield. Only the dawning horror that the rules of privilege he had always relied upon were crumbling beneath his feet. Meanwhile, Air France scrambled into damage control mode. A hastily drafted press release was issued within hours. We regret the unfortunate incident involving one of our senior flight attendants and extend our sincere apologies to President Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso. The statement was clinical, lifeless, empty. It did nothing to stem the rising tide of outrage. Across Africa, from Lagos to Nairobi, Dakar to Johannesburg, voices rose in anger and solidarity. Young people especially flooded the internet with messages of pride, anger, and a burning demand for respect. Memes spread rapidly. Side-by-side images of Claire's smug face on the plane and her shocked expression in handcuffs. Quotes from Ibrahim Traoré's speech about dignity, humanity, and the new Africa were shared by the thousands, then millions. The message was clear. This was no longer just about one flight. It was about history. It was about every invisible insult, every silent humiliation, every time someone was judged unworthy by the color of their skin or the simplicity of their clothes. And now at last, the world was watching. Inside the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a small gathering of journalists. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke simply, firmly, with the same unshakable dignity he had carried aboard that aircraft. In Burkina Faso, he said, we respect people for their humanity, not for their wealth, their connections, or the color of their skin. We are not a colony. We are a sovereign nation, and we will defend the honor of our people, always. His words reverberated far beyond the room. They echoed through the hearts of millions who had long yearned for such leadership. They ignited a fire that no apology from a European airline could extinguish. Meanwhile, Claire sat alone in her holding cell, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The polished veneer of superiority she had worn so easily during the flight was gone now, stripped away by the cold, unflinching reality of accountability. And somewhere, in the solitude of his confinement, the CEO finally understood what it felt like to be small, to be powerless in a world where his money, his influence, his arrogance no longer held sway. The ground had shifted, and there would be no going back. By the next morning, the story had traveled farther and faster than any airplane ever could. It was no longer just whispers in airport terminals or trending hashtags among African youth. It had erupted into a global headline. Flight attendant arrested after assaulting African president on international flight. Burkina Faso's leader humiliated. World demands answers from Air France. Africa's quiet revolution against racism goes viral. Major news outlets scrambled for footage. Talk shows dissected the events frame by frame. Political analysts debated the implications with barely concealed awe. But across Africa and far beyond, the message was simpler and far more powerful. Respect is not negotiable, and this time the world would listen. Air France plunged into a full-blown crisis. Behind closed doors at corporate headquarters in Paris, executives barked frantic orders, held emergency meetings, and drafted apologies that sounded increasingly hollow with each passing hour. They suspended Claire immediately. They promised a full internal investigation. They pledged renewed diversity and sensitivity training. But none of it mattered. The damage was done. Across West Africa, calls for boycotts exploded. In Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria, customers canceled flights en masse. Travel agencies refused to book tickets on Air France. Influential African celebrities, politicians, and business leaders took to social media, denouncing not just the airline, but the broader culture of casual racism it represented. We are not invisible, one viral post read, we are not second class, and we will not be silent anymore. The boycott spread beyond Africa, in the Caribbean, in Europe's immigrant communities, in African-American circles across the United States. What had begun as one arrogant decision in a plane cabin had now triggered a reckoning no PR team could contain. Meanwhile, inside her detention center outside Ouagadougou, Claire was falling apart. The first night, she told herself it was all a misunderstanding, a mistake that could be explained, rationalized away. But by the second day, as guards ignored her pleas and the reality of her situation hardened around her, like cement, fear set in. She wasn't just facing disciplinary action. She was facing criminal charges, public insult of a head of state, discrimination, abuse of authority, charges that carried real consequences. Not a slap on the wrist, but potential prison time, deportation bans, and the permanent stain of global disgrace. Sitting alone in her cell, staring at the bare concrete walls, Claire sobbed. "I didn't know he was the president," she whispered to no one, but deep inside, even she knew that wasn't the point. She hadn't needed to know who he was. She only needed to respect him as a human being. And now the price of forgetting that was bearing down on her like a tidal wave. Across the facility, in a more secure holding room, the CEO fumed in silence. He had made calls, dozens of them, reaching out to old political allies, powerful friends, even lobbying quietly through diplomatic back channels. The French embassy had tried to intervene discreetly, requesting leniency and offering vague promises of future investments. But the answer from the Burkina Faso government was clear, final, unyielding. This is no colony. This is sovereign ground. They will face justice here. When bribes failed, the CEO tried arrogance. When arrogance failed, he tried pleading. Nothing worked. For the first time in decades, he stood stripped of his influence, powerless before a nation he had once considered beneath his notice. And for the first time, he realized power without respect is an illusion, and illusions shatter easily. Back at the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the flood of international news coverage with quiet composure. He did not celebrate. He did not gloat. To him, this was not a personal victory. It was a moment, a necessary crack in the centuries-old armor of disrespect that had cloaked so many interactions between Africa and the world. He knew the real work would begin now, in how they rebuilt relationships, how they taught future generations that dignity was not a prize to be earned, but a right to be defended. Outside the palace gates, the streets of Ouagadougou teemed with pride. Murals of Ibrahim's silhouette against a rising sun appeared overnight on walls. Children wore shirts printed with slogans, "New Africa, New Respect." The nation pulsed with a pride so tangible it seemed to shimmer in the air itself. And far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, others watched and listened. For the first time in a long time, the world wasn't just hearing Africa's anger. It was hearing Africa's power. The world held its breath. Weeks after the infamous flight, Claire and the CEO stood side by side in the courtroom of Ouagadougou, their faces pale, stripped of the armor of arrogance they had once worn so easily. Cameras lined the back of the room. International media huddled in the corners, transmitting every detail to an audience now spanning continents. The court itself was modest. No marble columns, no sweeping chandeliers, only plain wood benches and a simple elevated platform for the judge. But the gravity in the room was heavier than stone, because what was on trial was not just two individuals. It was an entire history of humiliation, of overlooked humanity, of a world taught too long to kneel before power and dismiss dignity. And today that world was being called to account. The prosecutor stood, his voice clear and steady. He did not shout. He did not dramatize. He simply laid out the facts. A flight attendant, acting not out of necessity but prejudice, humiliated a paying passenger without cause. A CEO, intoxicated by entitlement, collaborated in the mistreatment and publicly insulted a sovereign leader. Together, their actions symbolized a system that had for too long judged worth by skin, by accent, by old colonial shadows. And most damning of all, they had done it to a man who, by every measure of their world, should have been beyond reproach. The president of a nation. But even if he hadn't been the president, the prosecutor said quietly, the crime would still stand, because no human being deserves less respect than another. The courtroom sat in heavy silence, each word sinking like a stone into a still pond. Claire sat rigid, her hands twisted together so tightly they turned white. When her turn came to speak, she stood shakily, her voice thin and breaking. "I didn't know," she said. "Thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Because deep down, she knew it wasn't about what she thought. It was about what she assumed and what she acted upon. The CEO was more defiant at first, listing his credentials, his importance, his contributions to African development. But the judge listened with cold patience. And when the CEO finished, the judge leaned forward and said simply, True importance requires no announcement. True character requires no excuse. The CEO said nothing more after that. Ibrahim Traoré never appeared in court. He didn't need to. His presence was felt in every word, every breath, every unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened. But a letter handwritten by him was read aloud before sentencing. It was not a letter of vengeance nor of anger. It was a letter of clarity. In the new Africa, dignity is not reserved for the wealthy, the connected, or the foreign. It is the birthright of every citizen. We will not teach our children to bow their heads and accept small humiliations. We will teach them to stand quietly, firmly, with the unshakable knowledge that their worth is not negotiable. The words washed over the courtroom like a rising tide. Some cried quietly, others sat straighter, as if a weight they hadn't even realized they carried had been lifted from their backs. The verdict was delivered in solemn tones. Guilty. Both Claire and the CEO were sentenced to fines, banned from re-entering Burkina Faso, and ordered to perform public apologies not only to the president, but to the citizens of the nation they had disrespected. But the real sentence had already been served. The shattering of their pride, the irreversible recording of their humiliation in the collective memory of a world now refusing to look away. Outside the courthouse, thousands had gathered, not to celebrate vengeance, but to celebrate dignity reclaimed. Flags waved, drums beat softly in the distance. Children climbed onto their parents' shoulders to see the scene unfold. When the announcement came, a great cheer rose, not of anger but of pride. Across Africa, in small villages and bustling cities alike, people watched and whispered, "This is what respect looks like." And somewhere, high above the noise, in the quiet halls of the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré gazed out over the city he loved. He knew the world would move on soon, hungry for the next story, the next scandal. But here, in today, something had shifted. Not because a president had been disrespected and avenged, but because a nation had stood firm, because the people had refused to shrink, because dignity had been defended, not with fists, not with fury, but with unbreakable, undeniable grace. And that, he thought, was how true change begins, not with noise, but with quiet strength that refuses to bow. The verdict had been rendered, but its echoes were only just beginning. What happened in that small courtroom in Ouagadougou, a moment that might once have been dismissed, overlooked, or buried, now burned across the world like wildfire. News segments replayed the footage endlessly. The salute, the handcuffs, the steady, unbreakable gaze of a man who had refused to be diminished. Editorials were written in every major language. Africa is standing taller than ever. Respect is no longer optional. The quiet revolution we all missed. But beyond the news cycles and headlines, something far more profound stirred. In villages, tucked among dusty roads, in classrooms buzzing with curious minds, in bustling markets and quiet mosques, grand cathedrals and sunlit fields, a sense of pride bloomed where there had long been only quiet endurance. For the first time in living memory, many African youth saw a living symbol of leadership that did not bow to foreign money, did not tremble before outside power, and did not whisper apologies for existing. They saw Ibrahim Traoré, not as a distant figure behind bulletproof glass, not as a speech on television, but as a man, a leader who had sat among them, who had worn ordinary clothes, traveled without bodyguards, and shown the world that dignity could neither be bought nor taken away. Across West Africa, murals sprang up overnight, vibrant explosions of color and hope. In Dakar, a towering painting of Traoré, gazing toward a rising sun, covered the side of an apartment building. In Lagos, street artists sketched his silhouette beneath the words, "We are not what they see, we are what we know we are." On TikTok, a new trend erupted. Young people reenacting the moment Ibrahim refused to give up his seat, sitting quietly, arms crossed, staring straight ahead as voiceovers read his calm words, "No, I will remain here." Millions watched, millions smiled, millions whispered the same thing. This is the new Africa. Meanwhile, Claire and the CEO faded into the background, relics of an era that was crumbling by the day. The CEO returned to France under heavy scandal, his reputation in tatters, investors fleeing from his projects across Africa as fast as contracts could be shredded. Claire, stripped of her position and facing an irreparable stain on her name, retreated into obscurity. A living reminder that ignorance, once invisible, had now become unforgivable. Air France bled customers for months. They issued new apologies, launched desperate rebranding campaigns, and appointed diversity officers. But no marketing slogan could erase the image seared into the world's mind. The sight of a quiet black man holding his ground while arrogance crumbled before him. The narrative had shifted, and the world, at least for a moment, had shifted with it. Inside Burkina Faso, the government didn't dwell on the scandal. There were more pressing battles: roads to build, schools to open, security to strengthen. Ibrahim Traoré returned to his work without fanfare, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But his actions, the way he had chosen principle over pride, restraint over revenge, had rewritten the rules of leadership without speaking a single boastful word. And far beyond his borders, others noticed. In Kenya, university students studying international relations cited Traoré's calm resistance as a case study in modern diplomacy. In South Africa, protest banners lifted his name alongside those of Mandela and Biko. In Haiti, young poets wrote verses about dignity stitched into the very skin of Africa's children. Even in the halls of distant parliaments, places that had once only whispered of Africa in terms of aid and exploitation, there was a new tone, a new respect, because the message was now unmistakable. This continent is no one's afterthought. This person will not be patronized. This future belongs to them. And still, through it all, Ibrahim remained himself. He moved without a grand entourage. He continued to travel quietly. He continued to listen more than he spoke. Because for him, victory was never about the headlines or the applause. Victory was when a boy in a dusty village, looking up from his worn school book, believed for the first time that he mattered. Not because the world allowed him to, but because it was his birthright. Victory was when a girl in a crowded city bus refused to bow her head in shame at sneers, but lifted her chin high, knowing she carried generations of strength behind her. Victory was when dignity was no longer something fought for, but something simply lived. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long golden shadows over the red earth, one thing became certain. The quiet resistance of one man had planted seeds, and across an entire generation, they were beginning to bloom. Time moved forward, as it always does. The frenzy of news cycles eventually quieted. New headlines replaced old ones. The world's restless gaze shifted to other dramas, other scandals. But in Burkina Faso, and across a rising Africa, something far more permanent remained. Not the scandal, not the court case, not even the viral fame. What remained was a change that had slipped past the noise and settled deep into the marrow of a generation. A quiet, steadfast understanding. Dignity was not granted by others. It was something carried from within, something no insult, no arrogance, no ignorance could take away. In schools across Burkina Faso, teachers told the story of the quiet man on the airplane, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in self-respect. Children learned not to seek validation from others, but to know their worth without needing permission. In markets and on busy city streets, people smiled a little longer, stood a little taller when speaking with foreigners, no longer bending their posture unconsciously, rushing to apologize for existing. Artists painted murals not of battles and bloodshed, but of peace, resilience, and silent strength. It was subtle at first, small waves in a large sea. But day by day, the tide grew stronger. Beyond Burkina Faso, the ripple spread. In Senegal, university students organized symposiums titled "The New Image of African Leadership." In Kenya, social media exploded with a new hashtag, "We Stand with Dignity," where young Africans shared personal stories of quiet resistance, pride, and self-worth. In South Africa, songs were written, blending traditional rhythms with modern beats, honoring a leader who didn't need to shout to shake the world. Even in Europe and America, conversations shifted, subtly, but undeniably. Organizations re-examined their internal cultures, airlines retrained their crews, diplomats tread more carefully, realizing that the age of silent compliance was fading. No one wanted to be the next viral cautionary tale. Respect was no longer a courtesy to be offered. It had become a demand too powerful to ignore. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré continued his work, largely untouched by the celebrity that others tried to pin on him. He built roads through villages long forgotten. He pushed for reforms in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. He fought quietly, relentlessly, against corruption. And all the while, he carried with him the lesson that had once played out 35,000 feet above the ground. That true power doesn't need validation. That true leadership is measured not by wealth or applause, but by how deeply it awakens dignity in others. He never mentioned the flight incident in speeches. He never boasted of the humiliation inflicted on those who had tried to diminish him. Because he understood something deeper. It wasn't about them. It never had been. It was about everyone who had ever been told directly or silently, "You do not belong. You are not enough." And proving, through action, not anger, that they were wrong. In time, statues were erected, not of Ibrahim's face, but of a simple, powerful image. A man is seated in an airplane seat, calm, steady, unmoving, and beneath it, a plaque with just 3 words, "I will remain." It became more than a phrase. It became a creed, a reminder to every child who faced prejudice, to every worker dismissed for their accent, to every woman, every man, every young dreamer who dared to believe they were more than the world sometimes allowed them to be. The story of that flight, and the dignity that refused to be uprooted, became legend. But unlike most legends, it wasn't lost to the past. It lived on, in how people carried themselves, in how they raised their children, in how they refused to let silent injustice pass by unnoticed. It lived on in a continent that no longer waited for respect from outside, but demanded it, expected it, and most importantly, built it for themselves. And on quiet mornings when Ibrahim Traoré walked through the streets of his country, no red carpets, no bodyguards blocking the way, the people recognized him, not with wild cheers, not with desperate cries, but with nods, with steady, knowing smiles, with a silent message passed from heart to heart. We saw, we remember, we are changed. And in those small, powerful moments, Ibrahim smiled back. Because he knew. This was the true victory, not loud, but permanent. Not for him, but for them all. Years passed. The flight that had once sparked outrage and global headlines faded from the daily news. The names Claire and the CEO slipped into the forgotten footnotes of history, relics of a world unwilling to evolve. But what remained, what endured, was something far greater. It lived not in scandal, but in transformation. It lived in the quiet, unbreakable dignity carried in the hearts of a generation that had watched a simple man, dressed in a hoodie, refuse to surrender his worth to prejudice. It lived in every nod of respect exchanged between strangers, in every young girl who chose to walk a little taller, in every young man who spoke with unshakable confidence, knowing he needed no one's permission to belong. The revolution hadn't come with riots or banners. It hadn't shouted from the rooftops. It had moved silently, from heart to heart, from street to street, from village to city, changing everything without destroying anything. Because the greatest revolutions are not always loud. Sometimes they are simply inevitable. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré continued to lead with the same quiet strength that had stunned the world. Under his leadership, the nation blossomed in ways that defied expectations. New schools rose in villages that had once been forgotten by maps. Hospitals were built where none had stood before. Young entrepreneurs flourished, crafting businesses from dreams once thought impossible. And at the center of it all was a spirit that could not be measured in currency or captured in headlines. The spirit of dignity. Not the fragile kind, easily bruised by insult, but the resilient kind, born from knowing one's worth without needing external validation. A dignity so deeply rooted that no seat, no slur, no dismissal could uproot it again. One day, many years after that fateful flight, a group of students visited the presidential palace on a school trip. They were led through the halls, marveling at the simple elegance of the place. No gold, no needless luxury, just purposeful spaces filled with books, maps, and the quiet hum of service to a nation. At the end of the tour, they were shown a small exhibit. Behind a pane of glass sat a single item, a boarding pass. Seat 2A, Flight 827, Air France, and beneath it, a simple plaque. True power is not the ability to command others. It is the ability to command yourself. The students stood in silent reverence, the weight of the words pressing gently into their young, ambitious hearts. One boy, no older than 10, whispered to his friend, "One day I'll sit in 2A too, and I'll know it's not the seat that makes me important. It's what I carry inside." Outside the palace walls, life pulsed as always. Loud, chaotic, beautiful. Markets buzzed. Buses roared down sunlit streets. Children chased footballs across dusty fields. And beneath it all, invisible but indestructible, ran the quiet current of pride that Ibrahim Traore had reignited. A pride not rooted in conquest, but in character. Not in domination, but in dignity. The world too had changed. Slowly, stubbornly, but undeniably. Airlines revised their policies. Corporations re-examined biases. Governments reconsidered old assumptions. Not because they had suddenly become better, but because they had been forced, gently but firmly, to see. To see that respect is not a favor. It is a right. To see that appearance is not destiny. That humility does not mean weakness. That true greatness often moves unseen until it is tested. And when it is, it does not bow. It simply remains. As the sun set once more over Ouagadougou, casting the land in warm, golden hues, Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly by a window, watching the light fade into endless stars. He thought of nothing and everything, of journeys taken, battles fought, and lessons learned. And he smiled, because he knew that somewhere out there, in a crowded bus, in a dusty classroom, in the quiet heart of a dreaming child, the revolution continued, not with banners, not with anger, but with millions of small invisible acts of courage and dignity. And that, in the end, was how the world truly changes. Not all at once, but one unbreakable soul at a time. Dignity is not a privilege granted by others. It is a birthright carried quietly within. It needs no title, no crown, no applause. And when tested, true dignity does not shout, does not tremble, it simply remains. Across the skies of prejudice, across the battlefields of silent judgment, one man's calm resistance reminded the world of a simple, timeless truth. Respect is not something you wait for. It is something you embody. In every corner of the earth where a child lifts their head higher, where a soul refuses to shrink before arrogance, the spirit of that moment lives on, not through anger, not through vengeance, but through the quiet, unyielding power of knowing who you are. And once awakened, dignity never sleeps again.